Video games are supposed to be fun. If it isn't fun, it's not good. Video games are art, and art isn't supposed to be fun. All the different feelings that it can invoke are worth more than it just being fun. 16,000 replies submitted. OP has been banned. Red is now locked. A couple of years ago, whether or not games should be fun used to be a big talking point. It still gets brought up to this day for several reasons, but I want to revisit it because beating a dead horse is one thing, but I don't think I've ever been near this particular horse myself, so it's my time to swing the old bat and have a crack at it. Or at the very least, I want to talk about the argument itself and why it became such a big discussion point in the first place, because I both agree and disagree about video games needing to be fun for different reasons. I think the intent behind the two sides is a bit more important than the actual discussion, which is why no matter what angle people take about the various states and forms of enjoyment of a game, the meaning of the word fun, the connection between fun and play, or whether or not there is a point to anything to begin with, a lot of the same talking points tend to come up. Whether or not games should be fun had always been a talking point, but it didn't really blow up into a huge key point for everyone until the rise of indie games. Walking sims, to be more precise. Though the argument wasn't entirely about those either. Other games would go against gaming needing to be fun, with quite a few pretentious flash games being made to prove the point that games shouldn't just be fun. They need to express various points, or they need to do some pretentious bullshit that has no deeper meaning other than, hey look, I can make this. Major AAA studios would chime in and argue against games needing to be fun from time to time as well, because their productions were busy mimicking film, targeting cinematic frame rates, and doing everything they could to look and act like a blockbuster popcorn flick. With so many people arguing games shouldn't be fun, you'd think they'd at least have some point, right? Well, yeah, and not really. I think fun is the wrong word for it. Usually whenever Japanese developers talk about their games and their design philosophies, the translations will state that it's about what they think is the most fun. This isn't a mistranslation, but it's not entirely accurate either. The actual word they tend to say is omoshiroi. While omoshiroi does mean fun, it has other meanings as well. You can use it to describe something being fun to do, something being funny, but also something being interesting. So the two main associations for the word are whether or not something is fun or funny, or if it's interesting. It changes the nuance of the word choice just enough for a direct translation to be both accurate but also wrong at the same time. Thinking about it from a designer standpoint, there's a big gap between something being either fun or interesting in general. A game mechanic allowing for a player to engage with it in different ways opens up interesting ways for a player to have fun with it. In short, it's interesting and it's fun. Good design and gameplay is usually fueled by this association. Something isn't just fun, it's interesting. And people tend to go back towards what Japanese developers say when they're talking about games needing to be fun, because the Japanese developers came from the perspective of it needing to be fun, but they actually meant it to be interesting. I think that the better way to think about how these two words work together would be something along the lines of engaging. Something being interesting enough to explore the possibilities means that you're engaged. When you're engaged by a game, you have a good time with it. I think it works better in general than, say, immersed or immersive, because you can still think of it as a game and a game world, and concepts as that of something you're messing around with as a non-real object in a world working together by a bunch of coded mechanics hidden behind pretty graphics, while still being in there. You're still engaged by it. You don't have to place yourself mentally into the world as if it's a real place to deeply be into it, searching for the different ways to engage and explore its possibilities mechanically. That's not to say that a game can't be immersive, but the mental association people have when focusing on a game being immersive tends to end in complaints about being taken out of it. The engagement ending when the surface level illusion is broken. This is how we get to complaints about games being too gamey, which is the dumbest fucking argument that you can possibly have when you're talking about a video game. You don't say that a movie is too movie-like. You don't say that a book is too bookish. That doesn't make sense. And I think the reason that we had this discussion with video games is because a lot of people don't use the wording, phrasing, or even mental association that video games need to think about them. Interestingly enough, most of the people arguing about games not needing to be fun tend to advocate games that never go beyond surface level engagement. Walking simulators tend to struggle with keeping people engaged, not falling for their surface level immersion. Part of the problem being writing and lack of complexity. Not mechanically, but even from a base writing and world building perspective, the reason they argue against fun is because most of the concepts in talking about games being fun comes down to letting players explore, solve problems, and mess with things as they see fit to get the result that they want. The anti-fun crowd doesn't want people to engage with their story that way. They have the one straightforward way of telling their stories that requires full control on their end, and they're going to tell it to you their way whether you like it or not. This isn't exclusive to walking sims either. A lot of AAA games suffer from this problem too. A good example of a game becoming less and less engaging as control is taken away from you is Fallout. I could go further in depth about everything that happened there since Bethesda took over and streamlined the whole thing, but we'd still be here next week and not even scratch the surface. Plus, there's so many analysis channels that have touched upon Fallout in depth to a better extent than I possibly could. One of the games that is usually celebrated as a walking simulator, even from the crowds generally opposed to it, is the Stanley Parable. The main reason people usually say is because it's fun or that it's funny. And while I do agree that it is a funny game, I don't think it's the humor that really made it as interesting to play as it is. What makes the game is the back and forth between the narrator and the player. You have your straightforward narrative, but then you also get all the ones where the game goes completely off the rails. It gives you this semblance of control before making you paranoid with a single loop that takes several restarts to complete. There's engagement there beyond walking from place to place, sometimes pressing a button, and don't look at the scary thing when the screen shakes, the scary thing will come out and scare you. As simple as Stanley Parable's story or even execution is, the way it brings it to the player engages more than a lot of the action games tend to do. I don't think engagement is something that is exclusive to video games either. Books are maybe the most straightforward narrative tool we've ever created, where it's just a bunch of text telling a story, but even that text wants to create a mental back and forth, an engagement from the reader. A good book isn't good because it's fun, it's because it engaged with you. Its story elements made you think about things, and the characters and what they stood for stayed on your mind long after you put the book down. A good book isn't just a story that passively happens. It's a long string of ideas that is trying to be conveyed to you and spark your imagination. Movies have music, scenery, colors, ambience, camera angles, and story all come together to create an emotional undercurrent and narrative beyond basic statements made by the characters. And it needs to do this because there's very little time to tell a story in a movie. You don't have the room to breathe. So whenever a scene is even drawn out, it's because it's trying to convey something to you by drawing that timer out. Everything is a narrative choice with movies, as straightforward and passively as you can enjoy them. They are still a very driven thing that requires an engagement from the audience. Television tends to have this a lot less, where television is usually just the same old, retold every episode over and over on repeat because that's safe and it's easy to kind of just fall asleep to. That isn't to say that every TV series is like this. There's a lot of very good TV series that actively engages the audience and expects some sort of attention or back and forth wondering about concepts on your own. And a very good video game can have all of this at various levels. It can create a world that you think about with characters whose motivations interest you. It can also have all these complex mechanics that make you wonder and think about how things interact with one another if you just try. Theory crafting is a thing that exists for a reason, because once mechanics become complex enough, who even knows what the result of putting a bunch of mechanics together will end up looking like? It doesn't need to do all of these things. Lost Odyssey managed to do more with typography and music than it did with all of its actual gameplay and cutscenes and music put together. In the hands of a capable creator, it needs one or two elements interacting with each other, engaging the player at best. Putting a bunch of books in a corner removed from gameplay, making you walk forward until the creator has droned empty prose at you long enough until he feels that he's hammered his weak points at you enough, copying tropes from blockbuster action movies while asking the player to sometimes press a button during the action, that's not engaging. That's failed design from a creator who doesn't know how to present their ideas in a meaningful manner. I don't think video games should be fun. I think fun is a side effect of them being engaging. Much like any entertainment can be enjoyable without directly being fun, but just engaging the audience in one way or another. It is interesting how the focus on games needing to be fun tied itself so hard to being engaging by itself naturally, while people started to argue about the direct meaning of the word itself for a long while. I play a lot of roguelites on my channel, and I can tell you directly that the ones that I think are all worth it were all engaging in their own way. Different mechanics working in interesting ways, stat customization, item synergies and effects, tests of skill. Those are all very engaging. The best two examples of bad ones on the channel right now are Rogue Legacy and Runestone Keeper, both games with post-death persistent stat upgrades that makes progressing a passive act with no thought or skill required from the player at any time. If you've ever seen someone play The Binding of Isaac while talking out their reasoning as to what they're doing with their resources and where to go next, you know exactly what I mean. A lot of the better roguelites can be frustrating as hell to improve and understand at times. I wouldn't say they're always fun to play, but even the levels of frustration they created came from a level of engagement and at that point investment put in what wasn't just a frame of time spent. I still see people talk about things needing to be fun or not a lot these days, even though most of the original conversation around it has dried up. That said, a lot of it these days comes from people being upset at fun being a buzzword. It usually comes down to them believing games aren't supposed to be fun because they're not having any. They think other people are struggling playing games just as much as they are, and that this struggle with getting to the end of the game is completely normal and how it's supposed to be. So others playing for their own enjoyment have to have the wrong outlook at games, all because they're too insecure to admit that maybe they're not as good as others at certain games and need extra rules on how a game is to be played correctly. So I dedicate this video to the Dark Souls fanbase. That's not to say that there aren't any people on the opposite end who can't understand different concepts are enjoyable to different people, so if it doesn't engage them, it shouldn't exist to begin with. Those people exist as well. So this video is equally dedicated to NeoGAF. Anyway, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see ya.